Thank you everyone for attending here in person at Topman Nye C room, as well as for all of our Zoom participants. We're really excited to continue Arctic Climate Week at the Harvard Kennedy School for what is a continued conversation about the impacts of climate change in the Arctic region and their global implications. Today joining us, we have Faculty Associate Jennifer Spence, as well as Senior Fellow Joel Clement from the Arctic Initiative here at the Harvard Kennedy School. They will be having a conversation about advancing Arctic resilience through the Arctic Council. To kick things off, I'll give a brief introduction of the Arctic Initiative here. I'll talk about the event structure, and then I'll turn it over to an MPA student, Mia Dahl, also a two-time summer research assistant with the Arctic Initiative, who will do the introduction of Jen and Joel. We'll then turn it over after some introduction remarks from Jen and Joel and a brief presentation, over to two current research assistants for the fall and spring, Isaac Kim, and also Belfer Young Leader Fellow and Research Assistant, Gemma Holt. They'll help us launch into the question and answer portion of the event, in which we'll alternate between in-person questions as well as Zoom questions. For those who are attending on Zoom, we are extremely grateful that you're here with the Zoom hybrid participation format, so you can go ahead and enter questions throughout during the chat feature. We'll then do our best to integrate those into live Q&A for the second portion of the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mia to give an introduction of Jen and Joel.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. I'm really happy to be able to present Joel and Jen today. Starting with Joel. Joel Clement is a senior fellow at the Arctic Initiative here at HKS, and he's focused his work particularly on climate and energy issues, on resilience and climate change, risk adaptation, on conservation, and on the role of indigenous knowledge and involvement. And before joining here at the Kennedy School, Joel served as an executive at the US Department of the Interior for about 7 years. He resigned from public service in October 2017 as a whistleblower under the previous administration. And in that year, he received a reward for civic courage. And following that, Joel has received several rewards for ethics, courage, and his dedication to the role of science in public policy. And besides from all the work that Joel is doing here at HKS, he's also a part of the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he's working on exposing political interference in science. So working with Joel, his integrity is noticeable, and I think maybe that's one of the many characteristics that he shares with Jen. So over to the introduction of Jennifer Spence, who's an executive secretary at the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group, and currently also an associate with the Arctic Initiative here at HKS. Jen is an adjunct professor with the Carleton University of Northern Studies graduate program, as well as an instructor in the Nunavut program that empowers Indigenous Inuit youth. She has a PhD in public policy, and she's an expert in sustainable development, international governance, and institutional effectiveness, with a strong expertise working in the Arctic. Before, Jen also worked for 18 years with the Canadian government in senior positions that related to resource management, conflict, and change management, strategic planning, and leadership. So Jen cares deeply about leadership by youth, and I know she's excited to be with you today, coming all the way from Canada. So yeah, really great to have both of you here and have had the pleasure of working with both of you. So with that, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you. So Joel and I want to really do this as a conversation, but we thought in discussing it that just a very quick sort of high level on the Arctic Council, knowing that there's probably different levels of understanding, just to give you the quick 101, but I'm going to go quickly through this so we can have more of a conversation. But if you have any sort of questions about the Arctic Council specifically, feel free. I mean, we really do want this to be interactive. So I will start there. And okay. So just very quickly, the Arctic Council is an international forum. So it's not recognized as an international organization. It doesn't have that legal identity, but it's a represented 8 member states, which is the 8 countries of the Arctic, and this will be my test of the different. Are you ready? So Canada, Kingdom of Denmark, which is strongly represented by Greenland and the Faroe Islands, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, United States, and Russia. I did it. There you go. And so they all have representation. In addition, there are 6 permanent participant organizations, and this is something that I sort of really, this is something that drew me to the Arctic Council. The permanent participants are Indigenous organizations that either represent multiple Indigenous peoples within one state, or multiple or one Indigenous people in multiple states. And so we have 6. There can be, there are rules of the Arctic Council that there can never be more permanent participants than Arctic states, but you have the Arctic Athabascan Council, the Aleut International Association, Wichan Council International, which all have representation in Canada and the US, and AIA, which is the Aleut, also has representation in Russia. There's the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and RAPON, which is the Russian Indigenous Association of Indigenous Peoples of, yes.
We always have to.
Yes. No, thank you. And so, but this is a really interesting part of the Arctic Council, in that as much as they are not signatories to the ministerial declarations, they do have all of the same, in a consensus-based organization, which the Arctic Council is, have a very critical role to play. And I'm really happy to speak about that. I think it's a really important part, but I won't dwell on it here. And then the last piece is the observer organizations. So there's states, NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and they also have a role, especially at the working level. I want to just switch so you can flip through. So these are the states, just to give you a sense. I always think it's valuable to look at the world from the view of the Arctic, and you get a much different perspective on these things. So, and then just skip through any. And then this, I also think is useful to show. This is the geographic representation of the different permanent participant organizations. So you get a sense that these are people that truly represent the diversity of peoples across the Arctic. Now, within the Arctic Council, the working level, or which is often referred to as the engine room of the Arctic Council, is actually the 6 working groups. I'm not going to go into the details. These are and they all have sort of specific mandates, although increasingly have to work more and more across issues because there's so much interdisciplinary work going on. Skip along. This is a visual. So obviously I have a preference for the Sustainable Development Working Group because, of course, it's the best working group. But this is a visual that we created just to give you a sense of the flow. So you have senior Arctic officials, which are usually bureaucrats or civil servants that are part of the departments of each of the individual states, and also the permanent participant organizations. And the ministers who actually make the decisions meet every 2 years. But then the direction that they provide is ultimately feeds into those working groups. And it's really, that's where there's sort of a discussion about the actual work that's taking place. And a lot of people stop there. They say the working groups are the engine. But as this conversation, I hope will show, ultimately, I think you actually have to go down to another level. And that's the activities and programs and projects within each of those working groups, because that's actually where the connections are made and the collaboration is developed, is through the expert groups and the project groups that are actually driving the activities that take place within the Arctic Council. And then it feeds back up through the system. And so ultimately those groups are providing advice, they're providing recommendations, they're conducting work, and we're going to talk specifically about the resilience work that's happening now. But this just gives you a sense of the flow that there's a sort of an iterative process that needs to take place. And again, I think it's also important to emphasize that more and more the working groups themselves are also interacting at the project level, which I think is a really important development. Okay.
Good.
I think so.
Okay, and my job here is to kind of dispel the illusion that you can waltz into an intergovernmental organization like this with an idea and it just suddenly goes to the floor and people vote on it, because the Resilience Project has been a long time coming. And I say that because I suffered that illusion. When I first arrived at Interior, and the Secretary Salazar at the time pulled me aside and said, "You're my Arctic guy." I thought, oh, good, I'll go to the next Arctic Council meeting, we'll propose some things and we'll get a go ahead. And it was absurdly naive of me to think that. But the timing of the resilience work, it started way back in 2011. And this was the Nuuk Greenland Ministerial. And it was the first time that a US Secretary of State attended the Arctic Council Ministerial. It was the first time that Arctic had become a big issue for the State Department. That was Hillary Clinton. And she was very enthusiastic about the Arctic, realized its geopolitical issues and opportunities. So she showed up at that suddenly the US was playing a much bigger role in the Arctic Council than we ever had before. And at that time, Sweden had proposed, this was during the end of the Danish chairmanship, Sweden had proposed an Arctic resilience report, or an assessment of resilience in the Arctic. And at the time, no one knew really what they were talking about. Resilience is and remains a somewhat vague term, and it's outside of the scholastic area of resilience. It can be confusing. It doesn't translate well into Russian or Norwegian,
or a lot of the indigenous concepts.
or and at the same time, those of us who were resilience scholars up until that point thought of it and continue to think of it as an area of endeavor that is maybe the best that Western science does in terms of connecting to indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing and being. So we saw a lot of potential. Sweden saw a lot of potential. The Stockholm Environment Institute led that report. It was published in 2016 during the US chairmanship. So we co-chaired that toward the end. But as that thing was starting to get rolled out, we knew that it was just going to be another report, follow the thud on every delegation's desk, and decided that we ought to try and come up with some kind of action framework for that report. Had a workshop in the context of one of the senior Arctic official meetings, and it just went so well. There was so much interest in this concept, which I was surprised by, because it is such a large interdisciplinary concept. But folks were really fired up to do something, and they said, take this to the SAOs tomorrow at the SAO meeting and see if they'll buy into developing an action framework. And this was well into the chairmanship, not a lot of time left, but we promised to get something done within the next 6 months and deliver it. And we did. It had a great international team of people from everything from the UN to the permanent participant groups to all the delegations and the working groups. And we delivered an action framework. So this was approved in the 2017 ministerial. The Arctic Resilience Action Framework, the ARAF, became the next thing, right? And it's not in and of itself an important document, but in the process of creating a project, you need something that takes it to ground. You have to go past a report. And that's where things were left. When I left government, we were planning every 2 years to do a resilience forum. That was in the report to the ministers, and they approved that. And it wasn't a requirement, but that was the next step. So we hoped that we were mapping out a project. But as with everything, and we'll talk more about this, it takes leadership, and it's kind of a dogged determination to keep these things alive in something like the Arctic Council. So what we'll talk about now a little bit is kind of what happened next. There were a couple of ministerials, and now we've got a project. I guess I could describe the project as it is, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sounds good.
So the project that's just been approved within the context of the SDWG, which is the best work. It's called the Arctic Resilience Project. And it's comprised of 3 pieces. One is a set of tabletop exercises to try and take permafrost thaw as the threat and map out what do communities need to respond to this. Let's create a scenario, say X happens, and we haven't gotten to the point of designing any of this. Then what? What is the responsibility of municipal authorities? What's the responsibility of state governments, and so on? And let's see what bubble up as needs for communities, so that we can start meeting those needs instead of just talking about this in a conceptual way. The second piece is a monitoring and indicators piece, which was very interesting to a lot of our sort of broader resilience community practice that's been developing since the framework was approved. And there's a lot more to do in conceptualizing this thing. But the idea is, once again, ideas to action. Let's take this concept of resilience and start mapping out what does it take to develop tools that communities will appreciate having, that will improve their resilience and allow them to measure it and so on. So that's the second one. The third piece is the Arctic Resilience Forum, which is, as of last year's forum that we hosted in conjunction with the Icelandic Chairmanship and the SDWG from here, the Arctic Initiative, we had about 1,500 people tune into that thing. So because it was COVID, we had that 10-week series rather than a small meeting in an Arctic town. And it meant that we just ballooned our community of practice and suddenly had very committed speakers and organizers. Just that there was 85 people who were organizing sessions and participating as speakers. So things really took off. That led, I think, to the approval of this project that I just described. So we'll do another forum next year. The Russian Federation has agreed to host.
Who's the current chair?
And they're the current chair.
I think the other thing I would add is one of the things we've really focused on is with the community pieces, having the permanent participants lead the activities. And so the Arctic Athabascan Council, for example, is going to lead the tabletop exercise. We're still in discussions with the Sami Council about leading the monitoring and indicators section, but we want this to go, this to be for communities by communities. And that means that fundamentally the process, we really needed to make sure that they were in on the front lines of developing this. So the proposal was accepted by the Sustainable Development Working Group with very general ideas of what we were going to do to allow the scoping to actually be developed more with the communities directly.
Yeah, that co-creation is something we frequently stumble with in the Arctic, and how to get that right. This is our attempt in this case to make sure that from the very start they're co-creating with us. And the idea is that we, the Arctic Initiative, in collaboration with the SDWG, we're facilitating, we're helping create the resources and the presence and sometimes the location to get some of these things done, and not come in as we have the ideas. Here are some things that you can do. The idea is, here we are. We got a lot of momentum on resilience right now. What would be helpful? And we hope to establish that as the Harvard reputation in the Arctic overall, because there isn't one really now. So it's a nice vacuum to try and fill with helpfulness rather than colonialist approaches of the past. So yeah, that's where we are now.
So that's our general introduction.
That's the quick intro. And we can, I think, in a conversational way, we could go on for hours, but I know we have some good questions queued up. Yes, but you may have questions, and I know you have questions, and I don't know what order you want to do things in, but I'm looking forward to the chat.
Great. Well, we can start us off. Isaac and I have just prepared a couple of questions, and then we can open it to anyone else who wants to participate. As Danny mentioned, I'm Jenna. I'm one of Joel and Jen's research assistants at the Arctic Initiative.
And I'm Isaac. I'm also one of Jen and Joel's assistants at the Arctic Initiative.
Well, I can Joel about the co-production of knowledge, and I'm just interested in hearing you talk a little bit about this idea that resilience is sort of a community level, local value. So what is sort of the role and purpose really of like an international governmental organization like the Arctic Council sort of setting the agenda and leading on that work?
Ooh, that's good.
You're handing that to me. I'm
Jen.
pretty sure she said Joel. No, I think, I mean, the thing is ultimately what I've learned in working with the Arctic Council is it has to work at multiple layers. And interestingly, when you look at these, the SCWG is often framed as the human dimension of the Arctic Council. There's 6 working groups. Most of them are working on environmental issues. And so the human dimension, the social, cultural, economic pieces of it really do sort of is where we tend to focus our energy. And a lot of our work is done at the very local level, working directly with communities, but often proposed by permanent participants. That tends to be we're the working group that has the most participation by permanent participants as well. But I have to say, like, I think we need to do more to translate what happens in sort of microcosms of projects and how that sort of is shared and experienced across the circumpolar region. So I almost feel like we're really good at the circumpolar collaboration, and we're quite good at sort of mobilizing at the really local. And where we sort of need to do more work is in that space between, because I think those are where that's where the real magic can happen of how the relationships between the international and the local will happen. Because frankly, if you go to most Arctic communities, if they haven't been involved directly in a particular project, they won't know what the Arctic Council is. And that means we still have more work to do to do the work in a way that's appropriate.
That's what I was going to add, is that we talk a lot about kind of struggling to get the Arctic Council to buy into projects, but there's also the fact that these projects, if effective at the ground level, can make the Arctic Council more relevant to more people, because the Arctic Council isn't necessarily embedded as the thing that's going to rule the Arctic forever. And it often comes up, because they don't touch national security issues, that there might be some body better suited to kind of managing geopolitics in the region. And so there's always a nervousness, I think, on the part of the senior Arctic officials, and making that organization more relevant to people and even know about it. I mean, frankly, what communities know about that intergovernmental body. So I think it benefits everyone to be creating those linkages at each scale. And it's not always a piece of cake, but I think it's important. Good question.
Well, then building off that question, Joel, I know you described resilience as the best Western science does to approach indigenous knowledge.
I'm not biased at all.
No, not at all. I was wondering if you and Jen could elaborate a little bit further on the synergies and tensions between Western frameworks and also indigenous ways of knowing.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot we could say there. I kind of want to start with conflict a little bit. And especially in recent years, because there have been some really well articulated points of view from the indigenous side saying, hey, you guys, we're pretty tired of getting a call right before you put your grant proposal in saying, will you be our indigenous partner? Or not even getting the call and just being out there, hey, could you help us get to the research sites, things like that. And it was a very well described position. The National Science Foundation decided then to require, in this Navigating the New Arctic program, which was their big new Arctic tranche of dollars a few years ago, require indigenous partners to be part of the conceptualization and implementation of projects. And unfortunately, most people interpreted that as, okay, we've got our project all cooked up. We really need to find that indigenous partner to get our grant. And so it didn't work. They started getting all those phone calls at the last minute. It was very disrespectful and a fail. And so there was another round of letters that went to the National Science Foundation. And trying, to their credit, they're trying to crack that nut and get it right from the, it's just there's so many colonial structures embedded in the grant making process that it's just been a rocky road. But with resilience, and I think what they've been trying to do is cook up the most multidisciplinary way they can to get at problem solving in the Arctic. And I think resilience fits that bill really well. And the reason I say I think it comes closer than other things to the indigenous ways of knowing and being is that it's very relational. It's about, and that means between land and people as well, right? The social ecological systems, which are sort of the foundational element, are inherently linked, and it's easy in the Arctic in particular to articulate those things. And so there's something about that makes me think, and the relational aspects between land and First people makes me think there's an opportunity there to build bridges, but it's not always been smooth. There are some, I would say, for example, the Inuit, it's been a harder sell, maybe, and I'm not sure why. We're still trying to understand that. We don't want to necessarily sell the concept to them so much as listen and find out if this is a useful way of describing the world in terms of engaging with this sort of colonial set of constraints that we're trying to overcome. That answers your question.
I have one super deep thing to add, and that is, I think one of the things that strikes me is, and why I have such an interest in the Arctic and why I think it's relevant globally, is because ultimately the accelerations we're seeing with climate change are happening much more dramatically in the Arctic context. And that means that people are needing to adapt and be resilient in ways that we're not even really understanding in the Southern context in the same way. But they're doing it, they've really demonstrated what it means to be resilient And so what's exciting to me about using the concept of resilience is that I think the Arctic has a lot to show. The people of the Arctic have a lot to show the rest of the world about what resilience looks like, and finding ways of communicating across the different worldviews, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, so that people can learn from the resilience experiences of Northerners, I think is a really amazing opportunity to empower those communities to be able to tell those stories about what it means to be resilient, which they have had to be for generations.
That's right. And that's, I published an article in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, and I think it was the conclusion somewhere at the end. I said, I don't think that we're going to thread the needle in the Arctic if not for Indigenous leadership, not participation. And I strongly believe that. And it's not because the Arctic is ever going to get back to what it was, because it won't. And I think we have to just let go of that, at least in human time frame. But that understanding of change in place is epic and incredibly important.
Would you talk a little bit about what resilience looks like in practice, both on the ground and in sort of an academic research context, and how it differs maybe from other concepts that are circulating in the Arctic region, like adaptation, and sort of why you mentioned it doesn't translate well. Like, why has that emerged as the framework for the future Arctic?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I'm sure the Sustainable Development Working Group struggles often to describe sustainable development. Those, there's been a lot of years and years of scholarship, but it doesn't matter. You're communicating to people that haven't been part of that scholarship, and we've had that challenge with resilience. But it has been, and one of the good things about the resilience report that the Swedish team put together, there are about 20 some odd case studies showing either particularly resilient communities or not so resilient communities, and what were the things they had in common in either category. And the number one thing throughout that seemed to be an indicator of resilience was local empowerment, was state control. And so it can be as simple as that in many places. Just, do they have the ability to, whether it's the colonial structures or other, to make those decisions and create frameworks that are successful for them, rather than, for example, in the US, maybe the Fish and Wildlife Service is calling the shots on harvest of certain species, and it doesn't, their lens on that is a lot more about the species and doesn't include cultural needs and so on, or it could be the Park Service, or in Russia, it could be an entirely different thing. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I would say is, for me personally, it resonates in a way that sustainable development doesn't. I mean, and it's maybe an evolution of thinking, but I mean, ultimately, when we talk about sustainable development, we talk about the economic, social, and environmental pieces, right? You've got the three-legged stool. That's sort of the general, and I know it's more complicated than that, but it still has this sort of idea that they could stand alone. Like you could make decisions on economic things or whatever, that they're still almost siloed in some way. Whereas the concept of resilience, for me, really illustrates or resonates this idea that you can't pull one thread without something else giving, right? Like if you have a water issue, permafrost thaws, well, that's going to affect wetlands, which is going to affect the reindeer herder who is trying to graze, the interconnections are fundamental, and so it's a way of thinking about things that allows you to really see those interconnections, which I think makes it so powerful. But the reality is, I mean, the same way the Sustainable Development Working Group, we're not going to be changing our name anytime soon. And concept of biodiversity, and we have the Conservation of Flora and Fauna Working Group, right? Like our ability as institutions to evolve with ideas, sometimes there's a lag there that is always happening. But I think we can do it with more flexibility in the project setting than we can maybe with the institutions.
And mind you, the definition of resilience isn't, I mean, for some people, it takes a licking and keeps on ticking, or the ball in the bowl doesn't flip out of the bowl. Those things that's sort of old school. Now it's, the ability of communities, social, ecological communities and systems to not just absorb change, but learn and thrive. So it's learning and thriving through change. And that is, I think, a pretty modern way to look at things. And I think it's something that really resonates with communities in the Arctic too, because they don't want to just handle change, suffer through change. It's about learning through it and then thriving. And in the case of these Arctic villages, it might mean a new or more advanced economic opportunity. Get out of our way so we can have better water and sewer, so that we can then export fish. Things that can actually help them thrive that they've been held back on by some of the structures that we have put in place.
We have a question on Zoom, and then we'll turn it back to the room. If you all, just warm calling on all of you to
Get
take
ready.
some questions. But we'll first go with Terza had just one comment of pointing out that the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission is a solid model of on-the-ground good governance in the Arctic, of an example of resilience work. And then
one of the case studies that we used last year. We did a governance.
You might want to speak a little louder.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Last year we did a governance study group, and after that with a research assistant, Rachel Westgate from the law school, and she and I wrote a paper looking at analysing resilience in a different way, depending on whether communities stay where they are, or whether they have to move, and whether they're moving as a community as a whole or as individuals, and sort of restarting their community in another city or another town. But that was actually one of the case studies that we used as one of our examples of this is kind of best practice. So thanks, Terza.
Yeah.
What's the
And that
question?
is just coming out soon.
wonderful. And Brittany Janice with their question in the chat. Terza responds with a smiley face.
Well, yeah, and thanks, Terza. And I wanted to mention that also the conflict avoidance agreement was an early example of kind of co-creating an arrangement that could work for whaling captains and for the oil companies at the time. And who knows where that'll go, but I'm glad that she's tuned in.
Wonderful. And our beloved Brittany Janice coming in with another question. You mentioned that there's an increased desire for collaboration between the working groups. This is clearly important for resilience since it is so interdisciplinary. Can you talk about some of the opportunities and the challenges when it comes to collaboration on specific projects like the one we're trying to launch?
Yeah, so first of all, we didn't mention that, but for the purposes of the Arctic Resilience Project, there's an emergency preparedness, prevention preparedness response expert group, and they will be participating in the tabletop exercise. And the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, which is the sort of scientific body, and the CAF working group, so the biodiversity working group, will be participating in the work related to the monitoring and indicators. So this is a perfect example of where the working groups are sort of coming together. I think one of the greatest challenges to that is ultimately twofold. One is we all have, because we're all organizations that have been built from the bottom up by the communities of practice that they serve. We have different procedures. We have different ways of making decisions. And so somehow the secretariats and the heads of delegation have to find avenues to get the projects approved and accepted and communicated and advanced in each of the working groups in parallel, recognizing that the procedures are extremely different in each of those contexts. The other thing is people. I have to have a relationship and know the other working groups and what they're involved in, and have a relationship with other people. And one person leaves, and sometimes that leaves a hole. And so the lack of continuity in institutions of any kind make projects fragile. No matter what the project is, you need that the relationships that exist within the institution are important. And because they're informal in the Arctic context, they're not formal relationships, it requires, there's no clear path for each person finds their own way through it.
Now, to illustrate that point too, the first resilience forum was in Rovaniemi, and the working groups were invited to that one. There was no clear project and no strong leadership. So the working groups were kind of left with, okay, but what are we going to do here? What's, where's the thing? And frankly, it was Jen coming in, I think, as a strong leader on this stuff, and that one working group that was tasked with this to really kind of create some momentum around it, so that the concrete project and some leadership, I think, every time are going to be, if not a home run, at least get some people on base. So it's really important, especially when working with the other working groups. because they're very turfy. It took me years to learn that, and I stepped in it a couple of times. Yeah.
Thanks you, Jan and Joel, for this really exciting topic. I always like to talk about the Arctic Council, especially when my country is chairing this institution. And I have like two small questions. One is related to the structure. I mean, you mentioned that there are also observers, so I'm wondering what is their contribution in terms of the improving resilience of local communities, if there is any. And the second one, since we're living on the pandemic, what is the role of the Arctic Council, and what kind of the weak side that you noticed during like this the functioning of the Arctic Council under the pandemic that should be strengthened?
We could mention the pandemic and answer your first question about what is resilience and have we seen it, I think is what you were asking. And because one of the things that we learned from AAC, the Permanent Participant Group, in planning the tabletop exercise was, for example, we didn't know what was coming. COVID hit, and we hadn't workshopped any of this stuff. We just hadn't planned for any of these scenarios, and we were caught flat-footed. Let's make sure that's not the case with, in this case, permafrost. And I think that alone demonstrates the resilience that has emerged because of COVID. I think that new set of scenarios kind of woke people up to new possibilities in the changing Arctic. So it strikes me as very interesting.
I would, and sort of sticking with the same question, I would say I think it's extremely difficult to start a chairmanship in this virtual world. There's been a lot of effort put into hopefully having an in-person meeting. I think Iceland had already had a chance in its chairmanship to bring people together so that those relationships could be formed, and then you can sustain them in a virtual context. And I think this applies to a lot of international organizations. But frankly, just the time zones, right, is when you're working when we organize a meeting of the Arctic Council, you're dealing with people in every single time zone. And that means that you're making hard decisions about who's going to be able to participate in a meaningful way and who isn't. And for example, there's an SAO meeting that's being planned for the end of the month. It'll be the first hybrid event. So there's been a rule as of yet that it's either all or nothing, but there's such a great demand now to have people come in person. This is the first time they will have some people in person and some people not in person. But I appreciate the value of that relationship building that really is critical in an international organization like this, so that needs to happen. In terms of your other question, which I did have an answer to, but now I forget what the question was.
About the role of observers.
Oh yes, well, for the resilience part, this is what's kind of cool. And Joel, I know we're trying to get to the sort of chance for interactive, but the online sessions that happened last year with a huge leadership from Harvard was brought together an amazing community, and it wasn't limited to whether you had observer status or not. We invited observers, but basically, if you were interested and we broke it out into themes and stuff, then you could participate in those conversations. So we built the community around those types of things, and that community has stayed. So when we started to develop the concept for the next piece, that community came back, and they were the ones that developed this proposal. And a lot of them are observers. So we have the Social Science Association, we have the Arctic Association. Wait, IASA. UArctic, we have the reindeer herders, we have an amazing community that it's been quite open. WWF is involved, and I'm saying this off the cuff, but I think it's actually the most inclusive project that there is right now in terms of the participants involved, and everybody has a different area they're interested in, but it has had a large observer participation.
Except for the observer states, other than the UK and EU observer state, because I was kind of waiting to see if some of the Asian nations and Poland and France and some of these others might
yes,
get on board.
It's true. More NGOs and intergovernmental organizations.
But they did participate in the Resilience Forum. In fact, we had someone from the Vatican in one of our sessions. So
we think they were in.
They were registered as from the Vatican.
Thanks a lot for sharing your expertise with us. I have know very little about the Arctic Council. Now, obviously, a bit more.
Now you're an
given
expert.
that
But you touched upon the fact that the Arctic Council doesn't discuss or touch on national security. And I'm wondering how much that impacts the work, for example, in the Sustainable Development Group, because given that climate change will pose significant questions around national security, how is the Arctic Council dealing with that? And then, like, how are they addressing the topic with maybe other types of organizations or states directly?
Yes, it's sort of a paradox. We talk about this multidisciplinary resilience thing, and we're not really going there on security issues. How the Arctic Council?
I have an opinion. I mean, I would sort of argue that part of the reason the Arctic Council has been able to do some really interesting things is because it didn't have security in its bailiwick. And I actually would say that part of the culture of collaboration and this emphasis on peace and cooperation in a space that involves super, tense state sort of dynamics in other contexts was only really possible because of the exclusion of military security type issues. Now, having said that, I think that the environment is evolving. And I think what's interesting is what you're seeing is a sort of mission creep. So I don't think you'll ever see military security on there, but you do see search and rescue, which in some of the states actually includes the military. So there's become a gray zone that everybody sort of has allowed the Arctic Council to slip into. But there are sort of ongoing discussions about where those sort of more sort of hard security type issues should be. But I'm not sure I'd ever make the case that it should be in the same place, just because I think you would lose a lot more than you would gain from that, including it.
I agree with that. In the U.S. context, it was the government side. Imagine there are probably a dozen federal agencies involved in some way, including the EPA and the Interior Department, in addition to the Department of State. If DOD was suddenly part of that group, a lot of them will be gone. You just get more engagement. DOD is quite an immense presence, and that they would have to be in a leadership post. And in fact, the State Department would often take second seat. So it would create a lot of problems, at least in the U.S. context. But I am still challenged, though, by that issue. When we're dealing with resilience, and these questions come up a lot, how it relates to security. And I like the notion of kind of human security, health, food security, water security, as opposed to military-related national security questions. But yeah,
but when it comes to environmental response type of things, like we have entered that, the Arctic Council has entered that space.
Yeah.
So it really becomes about your sort of classic military kind of, which is still important. I'm not dismissing it,
but that's Homeland Security Department, not DOD, which Coast Guard. So that helps a little bit. Yeah.
We have another question from Zoom, and then we'll alternate back to in person, and then we have another one teed up too. So this one is Arctic Initiative visiting scholar Doug Housey.
Hi, Doug.
Hi, Doug.
How has human resilience at local levels improved by the increased action? Doug is also waving. You can kind of see him right there. How has human resilience at local levels improved by the increased action by the Arctic Council? How are the results of Arctic Council actions assessed and compared?
Oh, Doug, don't ask that question.
Well, there are a lot of projects that I think you can point to, many in the Sustainable Development Working Group, but in others as well, in terms of those issues of health, water and food security, and understandings of the role of the indigenous people of the North, and those projects that have elevated and highlighted those voices, I think have brought us back to that I mentioned in the beginning of this, how that number one indicator of resilience is usually local empowerment. And I think the Arctic Council has helped to lift those voices and build resilience in that way. This is one example.
Yeah, it's sort of the perennial sort of question is what's the results of the Arctic Council, and it's never been an easy one. There's been over the years, there's been a number of reviews, financial reviews of the Arctic Council to sort of say, bang for your buck, what are we getting? And ultimately, what's interesting about the Arctic Council is it's literally impossible to say how much money is spent on Arctic Council because of the way that work is done. There's a lot of in-kind contributions, a lot of you have people funding particular aspects of projects that aren't recorded. So they never flow through the Arctic Council. It has no financial sort of entity to manage that. So it's literally impossible to demonstrate. And there's also been a question of sort of what is the impact, and it's extremely difficult to measure in the Arctic Council context. There's work now taking place with it. There's a new Arctic Council strategic framework. And part of that is one of the pillars of that strategic framework is continuing to strengthen the Arctic Council. And part of that is about monitoring and reporting and sort of trying to better assess follow through on particular commitments. It has been criticized in the past for, doing the reports that don't really go anywhere. But I think there is a consciousness of those issues and more work sort of thinking going into how we demonstrate more directly the impact. I think there's been research done to sort of show some of the indirect effects, but measuring and actually being able to say this came from the Arctic Council is much more difficult to do. But I think there's some really interesting case studies of where it has done more than just sort of produce a report.
Well, as a former funder, I will say we often suggested that people consider a contribution model rather than attribution model, because it's so difficult in many cases to take credit for successes or failures, but you can contribute to that success and thereby own it. And the Arctic Council has a lot to say about what it's contributed to. You just can't determine exactly whether it was because of the Arctic Council or a certain amount of funding. But yeah, good question, Doug.
We got a thumbs up. Questions?
Anything else in here?
And if the room is still thinking, there's another one in the chat. As you mentioned, bottom-up works. The Arctic states also signed binding agreements under the auspices of the Arctic Council. Can you talk about this process? What are the challenges in this kind of process between Arctic Council states, if there is any? This comes from Ida.
So, I mean, obviously, Ida has some understanding to be able to specify under the auspices of the Arctic Council.
She knows.
Yes, exactly. So just for the room to understand that the Arctic Council, because it has no legal sort of standing, ultimately there can't be an Arctic Council binding agreement. So what it is the states of the Arctic Council. It's through their mechanisms that negotiations take place, that they can form a special task force or have a discussion that may ultimately lead to a binding agreement. But the binding agreement is actually between the Arctic states themselves. So I would say, again, is sort of the same as and this may be a slippery answer, but the same way that our security or military security is not included, I would say that we underestimate the value of soft diplomacy in a lot of cases because it's harder to measure. And a lot of the good work that I think the Arctic Council has been able to do is because of that soft diplomacy environment where it's a consensus-based organization and you're able to navigate around the difficult conversations, frankly, in some cases. And if you change the dynamic, and there was a period where once those 3 agreements had been signed, there was a real sort of push, we need to do more of this because people sort of saw, okay, we've really done something. And then there was some backing off from that. And we actually haven't seen any more effort to sign any more binding agreements. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. I'm not saying there should never be another binding agreement, but I don't think that should become the end all and be all of the Arctic Council. I think it would change the nature of the institution if that became its primary focus.
Well, I would add, thanks for asking that question, Ida, and for tuning in. I have yet to see, and maybe you can correct this, Jen, any evidence that the search and rescue agreement has had any effect whatsoever.
Well, this comes back to the implementation. At the end of the day, there's no enforcement function within the body, nor any other body that's been set up. Although the EPPR does do some monitoring or some tracking of the commitments, but it doesn't.
And they do exercises.
Yeah,
and things,
but there's no enforcement.
Yeah, so that's a good question. All right.
The topic of the trans-Arctic marine transportation, does the Arctic Council participate in policy or in the discussions, or does that fall under the national defense?
That's the IMO.
Yeah, so, and the IMO has been quite active in the Arctic Council. So there's sort of a symbiotic relationship, I would say. You may know more about this than I do.
I've written about the IMO in non-flattering terms, so I might
Okay.
not. I might not weigh in.
But we have a
International Maritime Organization.
No, I know.
we have a protection of Arctic marine environment working group. So they're the closest relationship to the IMO. And there has been a move to do more related to shipping. So it is within the mandate of the Arctic Council to look at those kinds of things, the new polar code, although again, it's sort of that sideways kind of contribution. The new polar code, there was work done through PAIM, but there's, in terms of attribution, you would never call it an Arctic Council product, but it provides the mechanisms to access those experts who are already meeting already.
The IMO, for all intents and purposes, is an industry group.
Yeah.
It's not.
That's my.
Yeah, but that, and the Arctic Council, you have primarily policymakers at the table and experts, so.
Yeah, it's a weird fit. Of course, that's caused a lot of problems in the broader climate question at sea. So heavy fuel oils. It's challenging. I think the headline was, "This is the UN organization going backwards on climate change."
Uh-oh.
Did I say that out loud?